Chapter 16. The toboggan ran smoothly and easily over the icy surface. Occasionally the dogs slipped, but they had no real pulling to do. They were still fresh and eager when they trotted up to Jim's home camp that afternoon. The boy cut firewood until dark and then refilled his grub box from the supply of provisions in the cabin. He was impatient to get down to his Porcupine River line while the clear weather held. Up at dawn next morning, he led his team across the southbound trail and hit a fast pace through the frosty woods. The cold had sharpened. When the sun came out through the trees, it glittered like a million ice-sheathed twigs. Even the hardy whiskey jacks were silent for once, and Jim knew that when they sought shelter, it was a cold day. He found a red fox in one of the traps on the south shores of Porcupine Lake. It was the first fur he caught since before the thaw, and though the skin might be worth only $5 or $6, he regarded it as a good omen. Ordinarily, a fox was smarter and harder to trap than most other animals. Jim carried the frozen body to the toboggan and was kneeling to reset the traps when the dogs began barking behind him. Another sound reached him faintly through the flaps of his aviator helmet. A voice calling? He whirled to stare out across the lake and saw a dog team coming at a gallop, the driver riding the toboggan and waving his arms. It was young Lindsay. He would have known that black and white leader of his brothers anywhere. With a loud whoop, he flung down the trap and ran out to meet the approaching sled. "For gosh sakes," he shouted in delight. "How'd you get down here? Thought you were way up around Poplar Lake somewhere." "Hi, big boy," grinned the youngster. "I aimed to give you a surprise, only I wasn't sure just where I'd find you. Got an early start from my lower camp this morning, and when you weren't at your place, I picked up the fresh trail heading this way. Where are you bound? Going to Waba?" "Maybe I will tomorrow, if I can get over the lower line," Jim replied. "Come on and go with me." They traveled down Porcupine River in company that afternoon. When they reached Jim's lean-to, a mink and several ermine had been added to the fur on the toboggan. Jim looked at the half-open cabin and shivered. "Golly, Peter," he muttered, thrashing his arms, "it's colder than blue blazes tonight. Think we'll keep alive in there? You better cut some poles and close in the front while I unhitch the dogs." Back of the lean-to, in the shelter of a clump of thick young spruce, he dug out deep hollows in the snow and filled them with boughs. It was the best he could do for the dogs. He knew they would burrow into the spruce tips and curl up into furry balls, and keep warm somehow. Lindsay had closed off the front of the cabin with poles and bush, and once they had a fire going in the tin stove, the frigid temperature inside began to rise. Even so, it was so cold when they went to bed that a pail of snow water 6 feet from the stove had a skim of ice on it. Half a dozen times in the night Jim woke, shivering, to put another chunk of wood in the fire. At daybreak the boys hustled into their clothes. "If the dogs'll move in this cold," Jim spoke through chattering teeth, "we better head out for Waba. We'll freeze solid in the tent if we tried camping down below." They gulped some hot tea and dragged the teams out of their bough nest. Reluctantly the dogs consented to make a start, and when they had covered 2 or 3 miles, a light wind sprang up from the south and the cold began to moderate. A haze came over the sky. There was a storm on the way. It was more than 20 miles to the family's camp on Wabing, but on the hard crust the going was fast. The boys got in before dark, just as the first flakes of snow began to fill the air. Big Lindsay was laying down when they came bursting into the warm, lamp-lit room. He looked thin and haggard, with a shaggy growth of beard on his face. Jim stopped in surprise. "What's the matter, Dad?" he asked. The big woodsman gave him a twisted grin. "Must have got too ambitious taking that trip with you fellas. Been crippled up here ever since I got back." "It's a good thing you boys came," Miss Vanderbeck replied. Her usually placid countenance wore a somber look. "The girls have managed to keep us in wood," she went on, But the traps haven't been tended for 2 weeks. I don't know what possessed that man to go gallivanting off in the bush when he's hardly home from the hospital." "Don't worry, Ma," Ida put in. "We'll make out fine with Jim and Lindsay here. You know Dad's felt better today, and all he needs is a good rest." It snowed heavily all that night and most of the next day. The boys performed such outdoor chores as there were to be done and stayed quietly in the cabin the rest of the time. Bread was being baked and it filled the snug log house with tantalizing fragrance. Jim read aloud to his father a while, and in the afternoon the four young people played a few rubbers of bridge. About dusk it stopped snowing and the wind switched into the west. Jim took a homemade snow shovel and went out to clear off the platform in front of the cabin. More than a foot of snow had fallen in 24 hours, and he found it drifted above the window sills and halfway up the batten door. It would be heavy breaking tomorrow. As he finished shoveling off the platform, he glanced out to the west, up the lake, and stopped suddenly, staring. In the pale evening, the islands stood out, sharply black. Between the point and the nearest island, a bobbing grey speck was moving across the white waste. The distance must have been more than half a mile, but Jim was certain his eyes had not deceived him. Only one animal would make that kind of a leaping, floundering advance through deep snow. A timber wolf. Jim ran to the door. "Hey, Lindsay," he called, "get me my rifle, quick." But by the time the weapon had been passed out to him, the wolf had nearly out of sight beyond the southern point. He made a hasty adjustment to the sights and brought the rifle to his shoulder. Too late. Another one of those long bounds had carried the animal into concealment beyond the woods. "Mighty big wolf," the boy muttered to himself. "Wonder where he's coming from. Must have passed awfully close by Joe Leake's camp." The first day of February dawned bright and fair. With so much to be done, the boys decided to split up the work. Lindsay was to cut wood and look after the traps close to camp. Jim undertook the visit to the more distant lines. He packed a couple days' ration in a knapsack and took his axe and rifle and set out along the trail to the east. The snow was so deep it would have slowed him up to take the dogs. Even on his big 7-foot snowshoes, it was no fun breaking trail. He dug out one cubby after another without finding any fur. It wasn't until he left the Wabaing River and was plowing along the overland trail to his father's south camp that he took anything worthwhile out of the traps. Then luck came in an avalanche. He found a marten and 2 mink caught, all within a few hundred yards of each other. Camping that night in Big Lindsay's lean-to, Jim decided next morning to take a different route home. He knew the Waba camp lay almost due west, a dozen miles away, and though he had never traveled that exact course before, he felt pretty sure he could come out close to his destination. He finished his breakfast, slipped his shoulders into the pack straps, and put on the long, sharp-toed snowshoes. For the first mile or two, he followed the narrow, winding brook that ran past his father's line camp. Then, as the brook channel strayed away to the left, he took a straight line overland through the brush. It was pretty country, level and fairly open. The sun came slanting along the snow, edging the dark spruces with golden light. About noon, Jim emerged from the woods at the edge of the burnt stripland. The fire must have gone over the land years before, for a sturdy growth of poplar saplings now covered the ground. Between their shimmering gray stems he could see a dark mass, some distance off to the north. Watching it quietly for several seconds, he thought he caught a movement. Then the mass separated into 2 distinct shapes. A pair of moose, feeding in the poplar scrub. He made a mental note to hunt this part of the country next September, and moved on across the burn. There were dozens of moose trails, all made since the last snow, deep prints where the animals had waded through the drifts on their long stilts of legs. The burnt-over sections were not wide, and, A half-hour steady hiking brought the boy to green spruce woods again. If his calculations were right, he must be within 4 or 5 miles of the lake now. It could not be far to the end of a short trap line that ran east from behind the camp. He went ahead more slowly, his eyes alert to pick up familiar landmarks. The land dipped in a gradual slope to the edge of a muskeg, and Jim skirted it, bearing to the north. Right ahead of him, at the foot of a big spruce, he saw a place where the snow had been trampled deep and splashed with red. A few steps brought him alongside the spot. Half buried in the tumbling snow was the body of a young buck deer, torn and bloody, and all about it were the tracks of a monster wolf. Jim needed only one glance to tell him that this was the work of his old acquaintance, the lone gray killer of the squaw. The wolf he had seen crossing the lake at dusk 2 nights before had been heading this way. He had no doubt now that he had missed a shot at that big fella himself. Curious, he followed the back trail of the wolf and the deer. The chase must have covered some distance, for the buck's leaps had been short and weary towards the end. But the wolf... Jim's eyes bulged as he looked at those tracks. 3 full snowshoe lengths between the deep hollows where he had taken off and landed, 20 or more on a bound, in snow that must have been halfway to his shoulders. When he had killed and fed, the grey hunter had gone off at a more leisurely pace into the muskeg. Jim hesitated, half tempted to follow that trail. If there was plenty of food in his pack, he might have done it. But his supplies were gone, and he knew it would take days of the craftiest hunter to get within gunshot of such a wolf as this. Regretfully, he took his bearings by the setting sun and pushed on westward. A few minutes later, a blazed tree showed him he had reached the trap line, and before dark he was coming down past the dog kennels into the cabin clearing. While the boys skinned their fur that night, Jim told them about what he found. "You think that's the same one?" Lindsay asked. "I'm sure of it," the older boy replied. "I measured the tracks. There ain't 2 wolves like that in this country." Big Lindsay joined the conversation. "Shouldn't wonder if it wasn't the same wolf I saw on Little Current River 4 years ago. Big as a moose. Tommy Black Fox was with me, and you know how Indians are about anything queer in the woods. He started muttering things about witch wolves and said bullets wouldn't hurt him and a lot of such stuff." "You heard Emil tell how the track Indians were all worked up about this Eskimo woman of Joe Leake's?" asked young Lindsay. "They say she turns into a witch wolf nights and goes around looking for papoose meat." His father snorted. "Sounds like their fool talk," he said. "They're liable to be trouble if they hear this big fella's hanging around." Jim had an uneasy feeling as he listened. His memory flashed back to the wolf he seen on the lake, coming across on a beeline from the Cree's cabin. But he kept his own counsel. It was ridiculous even to let such a thought enter into his mind. If the animal did seem to hang around the Indian camp, the scent of all that freshly killed moose meat would be reason enough. "Let's play a few hands of bridge," he said, and took the stretcher with the marten skin out to the shed to freeze. During the next 2 days, the boys tended their father's trap line along the shores of Wabigoon. Ida took a dog team and packed supplies up the ice to the line camp at the head of the lake. She had a good supper waiting for them each evening when they came in off the trail. Between them they caught 2 mink or 3 or 4 ermine. The 3rd day they followed another line to the north between high, rugged hills crowded with hardwood trees. Tracks of deer and moose were abundant all through this country, but they found nothing of value in the traps. "I doubt if we'll get much more good fur," Jim remarked as they started back in the afternoon. "It's well into February and the breeding season started. That about ends the mink and fisher for this winter." But within a mile of the cabin, Jim found something that changed his mind. It was a fresh, clean fisher track in the snow. Both boys had the same thought at once. "Let's hunt 'em," said Lindsay. "This time of year they travel for miles and won't den up." "Good idea," Jim nodded. "Think we got enough grub? It might take a day or 2, you know." That night they filled their pack sacks with such food as Ida could spare them. "Tell Dad we'll be home about day after tomorrow," Lindsay told his sister. "We're going to go get us one more fisher to wind up the season right." "Don't be too sure," Ida advised him. "I heard Emil tell about fisher hunts. Sometimes they get away." Long before dawn they shouldered their heavy packs and set forth in the frosty dark. The fisher tracks led straightway to the north towards the hills. They were easy to follow. The animal had taken its time, stopping now and again to investigate a rabbit path. Once they saw where it had turned off a few yards, lured by the scent of a bait in a trap house. But after circling the cubby a few times, the fisher resumed its northward journey. About midday they came to a place where their quarry had killed a snowshoe rabbit. The signs of the struggle were plain in the snow, and a red-stained path showed how the fisher had dragged its victim to a hollow log and denned up for a time. The tracks leading on from the log were several hours fresher than those they had followed. "I bet he's not far now," cried Lindsay. "Come on, we're gaining on him." They made no stop for lunch, but held to the trail steadily all afternoon. When the dark began to creep through the trees, the tracks still stretched temptingly before them. "Wish we had a flashlight," Lindsay grumbled. "We're right back of 'em now." Jim laughed. "Haven't you had enough for one day? We've been breaking trail for 25 miles. If you want to catch your fisher tomorrow, you better get some rest." They pitched an outdoor tent with a bough shelter and a canvas Jim had brought in his pack. The fire was built at the base of a big tree, and as cold as it was, they were tired enough to sleep. Lindsay woke first at 5 o'clock next morning. "Come on," he urged, pummeling Jim's snowbag. "It'll be light enough to see by the time we get some breakfast." In an hour, they were on the trail again, their backs to the graying sky in the southeast. "Know where we are?" Jim asked as they plodded along in his brother's wake. "I know we ought to hit Squaw River any minute from the distance we've come," Lindsay replied. "Don't think so," said Jim. "He's been bearing to the east this last few miles. I recognize a couple of places we passed last night. Unless I missed my guess, we're over west of Whitefish Lake, not more than 3 or 4 miles from my home camp." "Well, go up there if you want to," the younger boy growled. "I'm following this son of a gun till I get a shot at him." Jim chuckled. "Keep your shirt on, kid. It may be a long time yet. I know Michael Lagarde hunted one clear to Albany once. 200 miles right across country. This one here seems to me he's heading for Hudson Bay." Before sunrise they crossed Jim's trail from the Squaw to Whitefish Lake and pushed on into the wilderness that lay to the south of Groundhog Rapids. The fisher track seemed no fresher than it had been the day before, and owing to the nature of the country, it was harder to follow. Repeatedly they found themselves checked by thick clumps of young spruce, rabbit bush as they called it. No use trying to cut their way through. They had to cast impatiently around the thicket, like a pair of hounds that had lost the scent. Eventually one of them would pick up the outgoing trail, call to the other, and they'd plow ahead on to the next obstacle. By mid-afternoon they found the fisher's course had swung deliberately to the eastward. Once or twice the trail doubled back a short distance, only to go on again. "He knows we're after him," Jim said. "Won't be long now. He's scared and worn out." But nightfall found them still behind their quarry. They made another camp, this time on the lower Porcupine River, somewhere miles to the east of Jim's lean-to. "If we don't catch up with him tomorrow, the grub will be gone," Lindsay reported doughtily. "I only hope he's as tuckered out as I am. If he is, he's resting right now."